4 miles. That number is where almost everything that has ever gone wrong on this coast begins. 4 miles of shoreline between a place called Sea Lion Gulch and a creek called Randall, on the Humboldt County coast of California. On a map, it is nothing. 4 miles is a long lunch break. 4 miles is what a reasonably fit person covers in a little over an hour on a sidewalk, without thinking about it, while listening to a podcast. The Bureau of Land Management, the federal agency that manages this shoreline, publishes an official rate of travel for people crossing that stretch, 1 mile per hour. That's not a typo, and it is not an insult to anybody's fitness. It is what the ground does to a walking pace. The surface through there is cobble, boulder, wet sand, and the loose rubble that slides off the slope above and piles up at the waterline. Cobble is the worst of it. Every step lands on a rock that shifts. Your ankle spends the whole day making tiny corrections it never has to make on a trail, and by hour 3, those corrections are costing real energy. Put a loaded pack on top of that, with water and food and the bare canister the agency requires you to carry, and 1 mile per hour stops being a conservative estimate. For a lot of people, it is optimistic. So, 4 hours to cross, minimum. Call it 4.5 if anybody in the group stops to adjust a boot, or filter water, or take a photograph, or sit down for 10 minutes because their knees have opinions. Now the other half of the arithmetic, which is the half that kills people, that 4 miles is only walkable when the tide is low. The federal guidance for this coast says do not enter an impassable zone when the tide is above 3 feet. The permit information for this specific stretch between Sea Lion Gulch and Randall Creek is stricter and puts the number at 2.5. Above that line, the water reaches the base of the slope, and the slope is not a bluff you can scramble up. It is bedrock. In long sections, it stands close to vertical, and the beach you are walking on simply ends at the bottom of it, underwater. Here is what a tide actually does, stated plainly, because plenty of people who come here have only ever seen the ocean from a boardwalk. On this coast, you generally get 2 high tides and 2 low tides in a 24-hour period. Each one arrives about 50 minutes later than it did the day before, which is why the plan you made on Tuesday does not work on Thursday. Between a high and the following low, there is a little more than 6 hours. The water is falling for about 6 hours, and then it is rising for about 6 hours, and it never stops doing one or the other. The number printed in a tide table is the bottom of the curve. It's the single moment at the bottom of the bowl, not a plateau you can stand on. So the real window is whatever piece of that curve sits under the safe line. Depending on the day and the phase of the moon, the water might spend somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 to 6 hours under 3 feet. Sometimes more, frequently less. And on a fair number of days in any given year, the low never drops far enough, for long enough, in daylight, to get a person across at all. The permit system for this coast publishes lists of exactly those dates, whole stretches of the calendar where the answer is simply no. Take the generous version. Say the water spends 5.5 hours under the line. 4 miles at 1 mile per hour eats 4 of them. That leaves 90 minutes of margin, and you do not get all 90 because the guidance is that you enter on a falling tide. If you wait until the water is at its lowest, before you start walking, you have already spent half your window standing on the beach watching it. Enter on the rise, and you are walking into a rising ocean for 4 hours, which is the one thing every agency and every guidebook and every ranger says not to do. Do it correctly, and the honest margin is often under an hour. Sometimes it is 20 minutes, and the whole calculation assumes you hold the pace the agency published, on ground, that is actively working against you, in weather that here can go from clear to 50-mile-per-hour gusts inside an afternoon. Then there is the part people miss when they look at it on a screen at home. The window does not close from one end. It closes from both. The tide is not a wall advancing along the beach from north to south while you outrun it. It rises everywhere at once, on the same schedule, along the entire 4 miles. The entrance behind you and the exit ahead of you flood at the same time. Being 2 miles in does not mean you are halfway to safety. It means you are as far from an exit as it is physically possible to be in a corridor with rock on one side and the Pacific on the other, and nothing climbable in between. There are a handful of ways out in the middle, and they are the creeks. Where a stream has cut down through the slope, you can sometimes climb the drainage, get above the water, and wait. That's the escape hatch. It's a real one, and the agency tells people to use it. It also depends on the creek being climbable, which depends on how much rain fell in the preceding week and on you recognizing that you need it before the water tells you. On the 21st of April, in 2022, 3 hikers on this coast, south of Punta Gorda, found out what that looks like from the inside. It was not a mistake of arrogance. The weather turned. One of them, Amy Perkins, later described gusts around 50 miles an hour and rain hitting hard enough to sting, and then the creek beside them, starting to rise fast, which is what sent them out to look at what the tide was doing. That is the sentence that matters. The creek that was supposed to be the way out was becoming its own hazard. The sea was coming up, and every route they had was closing on the same clock. They were carrying a satellite messenger. That's the only reason this is a rescue story. A helicopter crew from Coast Guard Air Station Humboldt Bay hoisted all 3 of them out before the day was over. They had a device that could reach the outside world. Most people who get in trouble along this shoreline do not. That single incident is the whole coast in miniature, and it is the reason this list is built the way it is. There are a lot of ways to rank dangerous places, and most of them are useless. Rank by body count, and you are mostly measuring how many people show up. Rank by how frightening the scenery looks, and you are measuring nothing at all. Rank by distance from the nearest hospital, and you get something that sounds rigorous and falls apart the moment you test it. Every place on this list is ranked by one thing, and it is worth being exact about it now, because the ranking is going to do something near the end that will not make any sense unless the rule is clear from the start. The criterion is how fast and how completely a place takes away your options. 4 options, specifically. Can you retreat, meaning, is there still a way back, or up, or out? Can you call, meaning can anyone outside your immediate group find out that something has happened? Can you wait, meaning if you stop moving and do nothing, does the situation stabilize, or does it keep getting worse on its own? And can you be reached, meaning how long does a competent rescuer actually need to arrive once somebody knows? A place that removes one of those slowly is an inconvenience. A place that removes all 4 in under a minute is what this list is about. That measure is a mix, and the mix ought to be disclosed rather than hidden. It draws on documented incidents and official reports, because those are the only honest record of what has happened here, as opposed to what looks like it should. It draws on exposure mechanics, meaning the physical shape of the ground and the water, and what that shape does to a human body. It draws on published tide and surf windows because on this coast, the calendar is a piece of safety equipment. It draws on the absence of high ground, the absence of communication, the measured distance, and the realistic time to rescue. And at the very top of the list, it draws on something most danger rankings leave out on purpose. How many completely unprepared people are standing there on an average Saturday afternoon? Some of that is data. Some of it is judgment. Where it is judgment, that gets said out loud. One more distinction before the count starts because it is the one people get wrong most often when they talk about dangerous coastlines. Severity and frequency are different measurements and they do not rank the same way. A place can be nearly certain to hurt you and almost never hurt anybody, because almost nobody goes there. A place can be quite unlikely to hurt any individual visitor and still produce a steady annual toll, because the visitor numbers are large. Both things are true at once, and they pull in opposite directions. This list weighs both. It weighs them differently at different points on the ladder, and when the weighting shifts, that will be flagged rather than smuggled, which leaves one question open, and it runs underneath the entire count from here to the end. There's a variable on this coast that decides, more than any other, whether a given spot is genuinely dangerous or merely dramatic. There are several obvious candidates: distance from the nearest road, the absence of a cellular signal, the tide range, the height of the rock above you, the temperature of the water. Every one of those is going to look like the answer at some point in the next 19 entries, and every one of them is going to fail a test somewhere along the ladder. The real answer does not appear until the last place on the list. When it does, it rearranges everything above it, including the order. 20 places, counted down. Starting with the ones you could probably walk away from. Before the list, though, the ground itself has to make sense, because the criterion is meaningless without it. Options do not vanish for mystical reasons. They vanish because of specific rock, specific water, and a specific set of decisions that human beings made and then unmade. Start with the shape. The King Range is a mountain range in Humboldt County that has the greatest relief in the shortest horizontal distance of any coast range in California. King Peak, the high point, stands at 4,088 feet. The ocean is 3 miles away. Put those two numbers side by side and the picture assembles itself, a wall of mountain rising nearly 4/5 of a mile in the horizontal space of a decent morning jog. Ordinary coastlines have a shelf. There is a flat bit, a terrace, a set of dunes, a road, a row of houses, a parking lot, some kind of buffer where a person can stand between the water and the hillside. This coast mostly does not have that. The mountain runs out of room and stops in the surf. What passes for a beach is the narrow band of debris the range keeps shedding into the water. And in the sections where the slope meets the sea directly, there is no band at all for most of the day. The reason the mountains are that steep, and the reason they keep on getting steeper, sits about 30 miles offshore. The Mendocino Triple Junction is the point where 3 tectonic plates meet: the Pacific Plate, the North American Plate, and the Gorda Plate. It is the only triple junction on land in the lower 48 states, and everything about the coastline in this stretch is downstream of it. To the north, the Gorda Plate dives beneath North America along the Cascadia subduction zone. To the south, the boundary becomes the San Andreas system, and the plates grind past one another sideways. Right at the hinge, where those two very different arrangements are handed off to each other, the crust gets squeezed, thickened, and shoved upward. The rock caught in that machine is mostly Franciscan material, an accretionary jumble of sheared sandstone and mudstone and everything else scraped off a descending plate over tens of millions of years. As bedrock goes, it is weak. It is broken along more surfaces than an engineer would like to count. Take rock that fractured that thoroughly, tilt it into a slope that steep, and then pour rain on it. And this coast gets rain in quantities that most Americans would not believe. Between October and April, the federal agency that manages the King Range describes it as one of the wettest places in the United States, with annual rainfall averaging between 100 and 200 inches. Not 200 as a freak year. 200 as the top of a normal range. That is more than 16 feet of water falling on a broken mountain that is being actively pushed upward from below. Weak rock, extreme steepness, extreme rainfall. Every geologist who has looked at this stretch has arrived at the same conclusion, which is that the erosion rates here are about as high as anything on the American Pacific coast. The mountains are rising fast and coming apart at almost the same speed, and the material they shed goes straight into the sea, which is where you get the cobble beaches and the boulder fields and the piles of slide debris that force the walking pace down to 1 mile an hour. That is the land side. The water side is worse, and for a reason that has nothing to do with California at all. Fetch is the technical term for the distance over open water that a wind can blow without interruption. Longer fetch, bigger swell. This coast faces west and northwest into the open North Pacific with essentially nothing in the way. Storms that spin up near the Aleutians or out past the dateline send their energy across thousands of miles of ocean, and it arrives here as long-period swell that has had time to organize itself into something efficient. A wave that arrives from that far away is not a chaotic chop. It is a smooth, heavy, well-formed pulse of energy that has been sorting itself for days. Then it hits the shape of this particular shoreline. There's no shallow shelf out front to bleed off the energy gradually. The water gets deep quickly, so the swell arrives at the beach still carrying most of what it started with. And the beach itself is steep. On a gently sloped beach, a wave spends its force slowly across a wide flat, which is why the ankle-deep water at a family beach is so forgiving. On a steep beach, the wave collapses all at once, and the water runs up the sand hard and then drains back down the slope with the same force, which is exactly the geometry that makes it impossible to get a foothold when you are being pulled. The National Weather Service has been explicit about this for northwestern California. Steep beaches let the full force of the ocean reach up onto the sand and strike with real speed and power. And once you are in the backwash on a slope like that, there is nothing to plant a foot against. That agency has also documented the specific behavior that comes out of long-period swell arriving at a steep beach, the one everybody on this coast talks about and most visitors have never taken seriously. A sneaker wave is not a rogue wave from a movie. It's a run-up that goes dramatically farther up the beach than the dozen waves before it did, because the arriving swell has periods that occasionally line up and reinforce each other. The National Weather Service puts the difference at up to 100 yards farther up the beach than the smaller waves preceding it. 100 yards. That's the whole beach, plus the dry sand, plus the driftwood line where people put their packs down, plus the log they were sitting on. There is no forecast for an individual one. Agencies can forecast the conditions that make them likely, using buoy data and wave models, and they issue advisories when the setup is there, which is most often between October and April. What they cannot do is tell you that the next one is at 11:22 in the morning. The advisory tells you the deck is stacked. It cannot tell you the card. So, a mountain range with no shelf, made of weak rock, rising fast, soaked by up to 200 inches of rain a year, facing thousands of miles of open ocean with a steep beach and no shallow water to soften the arrival. Which brings up the obvious question, and the answer to it is the last piece of the setting. Why is there no road? State Route 1 runs along the California coast for hundreds of miles, past cliffs and slides and headlands that are not obviously easier than these. Then it reaches the northern Mendocino coast, turns inland at Rockport, climbs over the ridge and joins Highway 101 at Leggett, and the coastline north of there is left alone for roughly 100 miles until the road comes back at Ferndale. That gap is why the region has the name it has. It was not an oversight. Highway engineers looked at this stretch more than once. The steepness and the geotechnical problems that come with it made a coastal route absurdly expensive to build, and more to the point, absurdly expensive to keep. A road here would not be built once. It would be built continuously, forever, because the hillsides it was cut into are actively falling into the ocean. In 1984, Caltrans formally abandoned any plan to extend Highway 1 through this country and stated that the construction was not feasible. That is the State Highway Department, whose entire institutional purpose is building roads through difficult terrain, filing paperwork to say that this particular terrain wins. The other half of the name is human. The area lost population through the 1930s, and the settlements that had reasons to exist here, mostly tied to timber and shipping and small ranching, thinned out or disappeared. The map emptied at roughly the same time the highway declined to arrive. So what exists today is a coastline where the land is falling apart, the ocean has thousands of miles of runway, And the single most important piece of safety infrastructure in modern American life, which is a paved road with a shoulder you can be driven along, was formally ruled out by the state. Federal land now covers most of it. The King Range National Conservation Area was designated in 1970 and covers roughly 68,000 acres along about 35 miles of coastline, from the mouth of the Matole River south to the boundary of Sinkyone Wilderness State Park, which carries the coastline the rest of the way down to Usul. One more piece of the setting, and it is the piece that sets the price of everything else. When something goes wrong out here, who comes and how long does it take? The answer has three parts, and all three are smaller than people assume. Humboldt County Search and Rescue was established in 1950. It started out as a mostly mounted outfit and has grown into a ground unit and a marine unit, and it is staffed entirely by volunteers. Community members, people with jobs and families who get a call at 11 at night and drive out into rough country in bad weather to look for somebody they have never met. That is not a criticism of the arrangement. It is an extraordinary thing for a community to sustain for 75 years, and it is also a description of the actual capability. It does not sit in a building waiting. It has to be assembled. Above them, in the air, is Coast Guard Air Station Humboldt Bay, which operates a small number of MH-65 helicopters. Its primary mission is search and rescue. It also provides medical evacuation for injured people in the surrounding mountains, and it covers roughly 250 miles of coastline, from the Mendocino and Sonoma County line north to the Oregon border. That's a genuinely capable outfit with genuinely capable air crews, and if you are hurt on this coast, they are very likely the ones who will come and get you. There are only so many of them. They are covering an enormous amount of shoreline, and they are not parked over your head. Locally, the Shelter Cove Fire Department is a small volunteer department that happens to maintain a water rescue capability, for reasons that will come up later on this list and are not pleasant. Beyond that, there is Southern Humboldt Technical Rescue, a ground ambulance service based a long drive away, and an air ambulance operator. Those are the pieces. On a serious call, most of them come at once, which is what the incident reports show. Now assemble the chain, because that is where the honest number lives. Before anyone can respond, somebody has to know. On most of this coastline that requires a satellite device, or somebody physically walking out to a place with signal, or a passing hiker with one, or a party member covering miles of tide-controlled beach on foot. That first link is almost always the longest, and it is the one that visitors think about least. Then the assets have to be assembled or launched. Then they have to travel over terrain that has already been described as the reason there is no road. Then they have to find you, which on a shoreline of repeating creeks and identical bluffs is not trivial without coordinates. Then, depending on where you are, they have to hoist you off ground that is too steep or too surrounded by water for anyone to land on. Nothing in that chain is fast. Added up honestly, and the realistic time from injury to hospital, deep in the northern half of this coast, without a satellite messenger, is measured in a large part of a day. With one, in good weather, it can come down to a few hours, which is a difference so large that it changes what kind of injuries are survivable. That's the arena. Now the count. At number 20, Usul Road. It earns the bottom of the list honestly, and it earns a place on the list at all, which is the part worth explaining first. Usul Road is County Road 431 in Mendocino County. It leaves Highway 1 in the north of the county and runs up into the Sinkyone country towards Shelter Cove. And if you measure the whole run, it is somewhere around 35 miles, of which roughly 24 are dirt, not graded gravel. Dirt, cut into a slope, with ruts deep enough to hang a passenger car by its floor pan. Blind corners, one-lane sections above long drops, and a surface that becomes something closer to grease the moment the rain arrives. The county has shut it repeatedly, sometimes seasonally to protect the roadbed, and sometimes outright. In December of 2025, It was closed from milepost 0 all the way to milepost 27.95, with no reopening date given, which had the practical effect of sealing off the entire southern half of this coastline from vehicles. Here is why a road is on a list of deadly places. Every option in the criterion runs through this road. Retreat on the southern Lost Coast means driving out on Ussel Road. Being reached means an ambulance or a sheriff's unit coming in on Ussel Road. The road does not hurt anybody the way a cliff does. It determines how much every other hazard on the southern coast ends up costing you. And it fails in a specific, predictable direction. It fails when it rains, which is precisely when the ocean, the creeks, and the hillsides are also at their worst. Everything degrades on the same weather system. The day you most need to leave is the day the road most wants you not to. What keeps it at number 20 is the recoverability. If Ussel Road defeats you, the usual result is a stuck vehicle, a long walk, and a very expensive phone call to somebody with a winch. It removes your ability to leave and it slows down anybody coming to get you. But it does it gradually, and it does it while you are standing next to a 2-ton object full of water, food, blankets, and a dry seat. You can wait it out. That word matters. On the rest of this list, waiting is increasingly not an option, and the ladder from here is essentially the story of that word being taken away. At 19, Bryceland Thorn Road and the descent to Needle Rock. This is the northern way into Sinkyone Wilderness State Park, and it is the same category of problem with a harder edge on it. From the little settlement of Whitethorn, you drop toward the coast on a narrow dirt road that loses a great deal of elevation in a short distance, and at the bottom is the old Needle Rock Ranch House that serves as the park's visitor center. The difference between this and Ussel Road is one word: descent. A stuck vehicle at the top of a grade is an inconvenience. A vehicle that cannot get back up a wet grade is a different kind of problem because the failure is asymmetric. Coming down, gravity is helping you and the road feels fine. Going back up, on the same surface, with the same tires, the road may simply refuse. People discover the true condition of that road at the exact moment they are trying to leave, at the bottom, in the dark, with no signal. The park has had this go from theoretical to actual. The Bryceland Thorn Road from the Four Corners Junction down to Needle Rock has been closed by storm damage, with no vehicle access to Needle Rock and no alternative parking anywhere nearby for people who wanted to walk in instead. When that closure is in force, the northern half of the state park is reachable only by people willing to add many miles on foot to whatever they came to do. It sits above Ussel Road because it strips out one more option. On Ussel, you can usually turn around. Here at the bottom, in bad conditions, there are days when there is nothing to turn around into. Number 18 is Mathole Road, the paved link that everybody assumes is the safe one. Mathole Road is how a normal vehicle reaches the northern Lost Coast. From Ferndale, it climbs out of the Eel River Valley, crosses the ridges, drops into the Mathole watershed, runs through the tiny town of Petrolia, and eventually reaches Honeydew and the Redwoods and Highway 101. Along the way, it does something almost nothing else on this coastline does, which is touch the ocean directly for a few miles near Cape Mendocino. The official trip planning material gives Ferndale to the Mathole Recreation Site as a 42-mile drive and tells you to allow an hour and a half. That ratio tells you what the road is like. Locally, a good deal of it is called the Wildcat, and the name is affectionate rather than descriptive of anything gentle. It is narrow, it is steep, it has no shoulder worth the word for long sections, and it is cut into exactly the sort of weak, oversteepened, saturated ground described earlier, which means it moves. The clearest recent demonstration was in January of 2023, when a landslide took out a section of Mathole Road in Humboldt Redwood State Park, about 1.5 miles west of the Highway 101 junction. The slide was on the order of 90 acres. Old-growth redwoods went over as the ground subsided under them. The road did not reopen until the last day of March. For most of a winter, the communities of the Mattole Valley had one of their few real connections to the outside world simply deleted, and the residents of the Lost Coast interior spent months routing around a hole in the map. 3 roads served the population living and working west of the highway in southwestern Humboldt: Bryceland Road, Bull Creek Flat Road, and the Mattole Road from Petrolia to Ferndale. That is the entire redundancy budget for a region the size of a small state park system. Lose one in the wrong season, and the detour is measured in hours. Lose 2, and you have people who are, functionally, on an island. Mattole Road ranks above the 2 dirt roads for a reason that has nothing to do with its surface, which is better, and everything to do with who is on it. Usel Road filters its traffic. Nobody accidentally drives 24 miles of dirt in a sedan. They find out in the first mile and turn around. Mattole Road is paved. It is on the state highway map, it has a center line for much of its length, and it takes ordinary tourists and ordinary rental cars to a beach that is genuinely one of the more beautiful places in California. It presents itself as an ordinary road. Then it puts you on a 1-lane section above a long drop, in fog, with logging traffic coming the other way. And there is a real gap between what the road looked like at the start and what it is asking of you by the middle. A hazard that announces itself gets respect. A hazard that looks like a country drive does not. That gap between appearance and demand is going to come up again at the top of this list in a much sharper form. Number 17, Chemise Mountain and the upland trails behind the coast. Almost everything anybody says about this coast is about the beach. There's a whole other network up on the ridges. And it is a genuinely different environment with a genuinely different failure mode. Chemise Mountain rises to about 2,598 feet at the southern end of the King Range, above the Deadliest and Wailaki campgrounds on Chemise Mountain Road. And the trail system up there connects to a much larger web of ridge routes running north through the range. On a clear day, you can see an enormous amount of ocean from up there. And you are, in one specific respect, far safer than the people on the beach. Nothing is going to sweep you off a ridge. Then there is the water problem, and it is not intuitive. Down on the coast, water is the one thing there is too much of. Creeks cross the beach every mile or two and run year-round, and the official guidance is that coastal creeks provide a year-round source, and you should purify everything. Up on the ridges, that same guidance flips completely. Water sources along the upland trails are described as scarce, bring plenty. And the springs that do exist up there are explicitly called unreliable in dry years. That's the whole trap in 2 sentences. A person who has read about the Lost Coast, absorbed the idea that this is a wet place with water everywhere, and then walked a ridge route in September, is carrying a mental model built for the wrong elevation. The mountains that produce up to 200 inches of rain in winter can be genuinely dry along their spines at the end of a hot summer. And a spring somebody marked on a map in a wet year may be a damp patch of dirt in a dry one. Add heat, which the ridges get and the fog-cooled beach often does not. Add the fact that these upland trails see a fraction of the traffic the coastal route does, so the odds of anybody walking past you are low. Add ticks, poison oak, and rattlesnakes, all 3 of which the managing agency lists as common up here, and none of which are on the beach in the same numbers. The campgrounds up here tell the same story in miniature. Deadliest and Wailaki sit on Chemise Mountain Road. Tolkan is up on King Peak Road. All of them are first come, first served, all of them are deliberately primitive, and the line that repeats through the official descriptions is the same one every time: no water. At Deadliest, the note is that the campground is near a creek, and you should treat what you take from it. This is one of the wettest places in the state, and it does not have a tap. There is a second thing about the uplands that catches people out, and it arrives from an unexpected direction. In dry years, the fire restrictions here become severe enough to prohibit not just campfires, but camp stoves. That happened in 2020 and again in 2021. With the order going into effect in August and staying in place until substantial rain arrived. A hiker who planned a route around hot meals and water boiled for treatment can find, on arrival, that the rules have removed the stove from the plan entirely. The restrictions are posted at every trailhead, and the responsibility to check them sits with the permit holder. It ranks above the roads because the failure is now happening to your body rather than to your vehicle, and because up here you are on foot, which means retreating is measured in hours instead of minutes. It stays this low because dehydration and heat exhaustion, unlike almost everything above this point, give you warning. They arrive on a schedule you can perceive, and usually act on. The ocean does not. 16 is Whale Gulch, and this one is short because the danger is a single mechanism and it does not need dressing up. Whale Gulch is the drainage that forms the effective boundary between the federal King Range country to the north and Sinkyone Wilderness State Park to the south. On paper, it is the seam that makes the Lost Coast Trail continuous, the connection that lets somebody imagine walking the whole coastline, from the Mattole River down to Usul. From Needle Rock, it is about 2.2 miles north to the Gulch, and the southern segment of the trail from Hidden Valley down to Needle Rock runs about 9 miles with moderate elevation change, which sounds like an unremarkable day. What makes it dangerous is that it is a seam, in the administrative sense. 2 agencies, 2 funding streams, 2 maintenance schedules, and a piece of trail at the edge of both. The Whale Gulch Trail has spent long stretches washed out. When a connector like that fails in a place with no alternate route, the consequence is not that you take a different path. There's no different path. The consequence is that a person who planned a through hike arrives at a hole in the middle of it, usually late in the day, usually with no signal, and has to make a decision about scrambling across an eroded gully with a pack on. That decision is where people get hurt in country like this, not on the hard part they trained for, on the improvised part, in fading light, when the alternative is walking 8 miles back the way they came. It ranks above Chemise Mountain because the failure is now a fall rather than a slow physiological decline, and a fall in a place with no signal is a different order of problem. It stays near the bottom because the ground is not going anywhere while you decide, and the tide has no vote here. 15. Bear Harbor. There's a small, quiet cove in Sinkyone Wilderness with a creek behind it and a scatter of rusting iron in the grass. And the entire reason it is on this list is that it is an argument in physical form about what this coast does to human plans. For roughly 17 years, from about 1890 to about 1907, Bear Harbor was a working port. Not a harbor in any sense a sailor would recognize. It was what the trade called a dog-hole port, meaning a notch in the rocks, barely big enough for a dog to curl up in, where a schooner would anchor uncomfortably close to shore while cargo went down to it on a chute or a wire. The Redwood Coast is dotted with these, because there was no other way to move lumber out of country that had no roads. The whole system existed because the land refused to cooperate, so the industry went around it by sea and accepted a level of routine danger that would close a modern port permanently. The Bear Harbor operation had a railroad. By the fall of 1905, there were nearly 18 miles of track running inland from the wharf toward a new mill town called Andersonia on the south fork of the Eel River, and a new wharf was going up at the harbor because winter storms had already damaged the old one. Then it went wrong in a sequence that is almost too neat. In late October of 1905, just before the mill was to start cutting, Henry Anderson, the company president the town was named for, was struck on the back of the head by a wooden brace while workers were adjusting a timber frame. He died about a week later. Then, on the 18th of April in 1906, the earthquake that is remembered for San Francisco also ran through this coast. The mill never opened. The company could not afford to rebuild the wharf or push the track east to the main rail line. The railroad and the harbor were abandoned. The town of Andersonia produced, as far as the record shows, nothing. That is the history, and it is genuinely interesting, but the reason Bear Harbor sits at 15 is what is there now. The Lost Coast Trail between Bear Harbor and Wheeler has been closed because of hazardous conditions created by winter storms in 2023. That's the same country the railroad ran through. A century and change after the wharf failed, the ground is still doing the thing that made the wharf fail. And a modern state park with modern equipment closes the route rather than fight it. Here is the danger, and it is a subtle one. Bear Harbor looks safe. It is a cove. It is sheltered by the standards of this coastline. There is grass and driftwood and a creek and the pleasant melancholy of old iron in the weeds. Everything about it says this is a place where people lived and worked, and it was fine. The rusting evidence that it was not fine is lying in the grass a few steps away, and it reads as charming rather than as a warning. Above it, the hillsides are still moving. Below it, the same swell that wrecked the wharf twice in the 1890s is still arriving. The cove is a place where three separate hazards, slope failure, storm surge, and the specific bad habit of trusting a ruin because ruins feel domesticated, sit in one small clearing. And the Doghole ports deserve one more sentence because they explain something about this coastline that a modern visitor has no way to intuit. For roughly half a century, the Redwood Coast north of San Francisco moved almost all of its freight by sea because there was no alternative. Lumber went down chutes and wires into schooners anchored in notches like this one, in swell, on a lee shore, with the rocks close enough to touch. Crews did that as a routine job. The wrecks that resulted are scattered along this entire coast, and the reason a place like Bear Harbor exists at all is that the country behind it was impossible to move anything through by land. Read that alongside the fact that the State Highway Department eventually declined to build the road, and the picture snaps into focus. This coastline has defeated every serious attempt to establish a reliable connection with it, by land and by sea, across 150 years. What is left is a wilderness that people now visit for pleasure, using a network of trails and dirt roads that is thinner and more fragile than the industrial infrastructure that failed here a century ago. It ranks above Whale Gulch because it actively invites people to relax, and because the trail out of it in one direction has been formally closed for hazard, meaning the option to continue has already been removed by someone else on your behalf. 14 is USAL Beach, and USAL Beach is where this lower band ends and the character of the list changes. USAL is the southernmost beach in Sinkyone Wilderness State Park, a dark sand strand better than a mile long at the mouth of USAL Creek, reachable only by that 24 miles of dirt discussed at number 20. It has a campground of sorts. It has no services in any meaningful sense. It has no reliable signal. It is beautiful in a way that photographs well and does not photograph honestly. Everything that makes USAL a problem comes from a mismatch. The road filters for four-wheel drive and does not filter for anything else. The population that reaches USAL Beach skews heavily toward people who have the vehicle and none of the rest of it. And the beach has a well-documented reputation for exactly that. Weekend parties, bonfires, fireworks, and a persistent trash and illegal dumping problem that the county and the park have been fighting for years. That's not a moral complaint. It's a description of the risk profile. Alcohol, darkness, fire, and a large, steep Pacific beach with sneaker wave exposure and no lifeguard, no cell service, and a 2-hour drive to the nearest emergency room on a road that may be closed is a combination with a predictable output. And the ocean at USAL is the same ocean as everywhere else on this coast. The same long-period northwest swell, the same steep beach, the same run-up behavior. What is different is the response time. From the Shelter Cove end of this coastline, there is at least a fire department with an ocean rescue capability. At USAL, on a Saturday night in July, the honest answer to how long help would take is measured in a large fraction of an hour before anyone even learns, and hours after that. So Usal takes the top of the road and access band because it is the first place on the list where the four options come apart simultaneously rather than one at a time. Retreat depends on a road that may be shut. Calling depends on a signal that is not there. Waiting does not help because the mechanism at a beach is not the kind of thing you wait out. And being reached is a function of that same road. Notice what has happened across these 7 entries, though, because it matters for the question that is still open. Every one of them has been about distance and access. Bad roads, closed roads, washed-out connectors, remote coves, long response times. If remoteness were the variable that decides how deadly a place is, this band should be the top of the list rather than the bottom. These are the hardest places on the coast to reach, and they are, by the criterion, the least dangerous. Something else is doing the work. Keep going. 13. The mouth of the Matole River. At the northern end of the King Range, where Lighthouse Road runs out about 5 miles past the tiny town of Petrolia, the Matole River finishes its journey and meets the Pacific across a bar of sand and cobble. There is a campground there with 15 sites, picnic tables, fire rings, vault toilets, and no drinking water. There's a parking area. There is a short trail through the dunes to the beach. It is, by the standards of everything else on this list, civilization. It is also the front door. The northern section of the Lost Coast Trail runs from here about 24.5 miles south to Black Sands Beach at Shelter Cove, and the overwhelming majority of people who walk this coast start at this parking lot. That is why it is on the list, and it is a different reason from the ones below it. A river mouth on an exposed coast is a genuinely tricky piece of water, and the Matoles is textbook. The river arrives with its own current heading seaward. The swell arrives with its own energy heading landward. Where they argue, the bottom is constantly being rearranged, so a channel that was waist-deep last week may be over your head this week, and the shape of the bar changes with every big storm and every change in river flow. The published cautions for this beach are consistent and blunt: rip currents, sneaker waves, sudden drop-offs, powerful surf, and a standing recommendation not to swim. The federal trip planning guidance for the whole conservation area says visitors should never attempt to swim on this stretch of the Pacific because of the undertow and rip currents. And it adds one line about the water temperature that is worth repeating exactly as the agency puts it. Without a wetsuit, survival is limited to about 20 minutes. That is the physical hazard, and it is real. It is not what puts Matole at 13. What puts it at 13 is that this is where the decisions get made, and where the people making them are at their least informed. Consider the traffic. Overnight use of the King Range Wilderness grew by more than 150% between the wilderness designation in 2006 and the middle of the following decade, from roughly 3,300 overnight visitors to more than 9,500 by 2015. Visitor days went from about 12,400 to about 34,400 in the same period. The response was a permit system introduced in January of 2017, capping entries at 60 people a day in the peak season from the middle of May to the middle of September, and 30 a day the rest of the year, at $6 a group. A permit system does two things. It limits the crowd, which is what it was designed for. It also, unavoidably, creates a document that makes people feel authorized. Somebody who has booked a permit 90 days in advance, paid for it, printed it, and driven an hour and a half from Ferndale on a road that took real concentration, arrives at the Matole trailhead with a strong psychological commitment to walking south today. The tide does not care about any of that. The tide window for the first impassable zone is where it is on that date, at that hour, and it is frequently not aligned with when a group finished their drive. So this parking lot is where the single most consequential judgment on the entire coastline gets made, which is the decision to start walking or to sit down and wait 6 hours. Every hazard for the next 24 miles is downstream of it. And the environment at the moment of decision is maximally misleading. The beach at the river mouth is wide. The parking lot is a short walk behind. Other people are around. There is a bathroom, and the ocean at that spot looks like an ocean rather than a trap. There's a second pressure at this trailhead that almost nobody outside the region thinks about. And it is worth naming because it is a scheduling problem masquerading as a logistics detail. Almost everyone who walks this coast walks it one way, north to south, which means leaving a vehicle at one end and being driven to the other. The federal agency maintains a short list of shuttle operators who hold the permits required to carry people for hire on this public land. And its advice about them is unusually pointed. Call one of them several months before your trip, and do not wait until you are standing at a trailhead to try to arrange it. So a typical group arrives at the Matole parking lot having already committed a vehicle to a lot 24 miles away, a shuttle driver's afternoon, a permit booked months earlier, and frequently a flight home. Every one of those commitments has a date attached. The tide has a date attached too, and the two calendars were built by different people who never met. That's the structure of the pressure at this trailhead. Nobody stands there thinking they are gambling. They stand there thinking about a car, a driver, and a Tuesday. It ranks above Usul Beach, where the ocean is arguably more dangerous per person standing on it, because Usul produces isolated incidents and Mattle produces the cascade. A bad night at Usul hurts the people at Usul. A bad decision at Matole puts people 4 miles into a corridor they cannot leave. 12. Punta Gorda and the ruin of its lighthouse. About 3 miles south of the Matole trailhead, the coastline pushes out into a low, blunt point, and on the bluff above it stands a small white concrete tower with an iron gallery. It's the most photographed object on this coastline. It is also the first of the 3 impassable zones, and it is the shortest one on the list by a very wide margin. The zone around Punta Gorda is roughly 1/4 of a mile, and the tide threshold for it is more forgiving than for the others. The permit information puts it around 6 feet rather than the 2.5 or 3 feet that govern the long zones. 1/4 mile at the agency's stated pace is about 15 minutes of walking. If you are wrong about the timing, the correction is short. That combination, high visibility and low consequence, is exactly why it belongs at 12 and not lower, because it does something to people that no other spot on the coast does quite as efficiently. It teaches the wrong lesson. Punta Gorda is a day hike. 6 miles round trip on the flat from a parking lot to a lighthouse and an elephant seal colony. Thousands of people do it who have no intention of ever walking the rest of the coast. They arrive, they see the sign about impassable zones, they walk through one, nothing happens, and they go home having successfully crossed a section of the Lost Coast Trail marked as impassable at high tide. The lesson they take away is that the warnings are conservative. The lesson is wrong, and it is wrong in a way that will not be corrected until they are somewhere much less forgiving. A 1/4 mile zone with a 6-foot threshold and a 15-minute crossing is not the same object as a 4-mile zone with a 2.5-foot threshold and a 4-hour crossing. They share a name on a map and almost nothing else. The tower itself is worth the detour into history because it explains what this water was doing to people long before anybody walked here for fun. Between the very end of the 1800s and 1907, a run of ships went down along the rugged, rocky coast south of Eureka. The last and worst of them was the passenger steamer Columbia, which collided with the lumber schooner San Pedro in dense fog off Shelter Cove in July of 1907 and sank in a matter of minutes. Accounts of the death toll vary somewhat between sources, as they often do with disasters of that period, but the figure most commonly given is 88 lives. The year after, Congress appropriated $60,000 for a light station at Punta Gorda. The fog signal, a set of compressed air sirens run by a gasoline motor, started in the summer of 1911. The light itself was first lit in January of 1912. Then came the part that says the most about this place. Keeping the station supplied and staffed was so difficult, in country with no road, that the lighthouse service families stationed there lived in something close to isolation for decades. In 1951, the Coast Guard gave up on it, put a lighted buoy offshore to mark the sunken rocks instead, and walked away. The land came to the Federal Land Agency, and in 1970, the remaining buildings were burned. What is left is the tower, an oil house, and the concrete pads where the keepers' dwellings used to be, on a bluff with the wind coming through. A lighthouse is an admission. You do not spend the equivalent of a small fortune putting one on a bluff that has no road unless ships have already been lost there in numbers. And a decommissioned lighthouse is a second admission that the problem was solved a different way. In this case, by improving navigation to the point where vessels no longer needed to be that close to the rocks at all. There is one more hazard at Punta Gorda that has nothing to do with water, and the agency is direct about it. The beaches below the lighthouse hold a colony of northern elephant seals, and it is the northernmost breeding colony on the west coast. Adults run from 1,500 to 4,500 pounds. They look, when hauled out on sand, like enormous inert sacks. They are not inert. The official guidance notes they can move very fast when disturbed, that they sometimes lie near or directly on the trail, and with admirable bluntness that an animal of that weight could easily crush a person. People approach them for photographs constantly. There is no version of that interaction where the person is the one setting the terms. There is a coda to the lighthouse that says something about how this coast handles its own artifacts. The tower did not simply survive by luck. It has needed active work to keep standing, and stabilizing a concrete structure on a bluff with no road access on a shoreline full of protected marine mammals is a project with paperwork attached. The Federal Land Agency has had to seek authorizations from the Fisheries Service covering the effect of the work on the seals and sea lions living underneath it. 100 and some years after somebody decided this bluff needed a light, keeping the light's shell upright still requires a small campaign. So Punta Gorda ranks where it does not because it is likely to kill anybody, but because it is the coast's most effective teacher of overconfidence, sitting exactly where the largest number of casual visitors will receive the lesson. And it is worth being precise about who that is. The people walking to Punta Gorda are not, on the whole, the people walking the full route. They are day visitors from the campground, families, couples on a weekend. The kind of trip where somebody brings a phone and a water bottle and not much else. They will not encounter the 4-mile corridor. They will encounter a warning sign, a quarter-mile of easy beach, and a lighthouse. What they carry away is a calibration of how seriously the signs on this coast should be taken, and they will apply it somewhere else, possibly years later, possibly at a place much further up this list. 11 takes two places together, because they are the same argument seen from opposite ends, Cooskie Creek and Spanish Flat. These are the bluff sections. Between the long stretches where the mountain meets the water directly, the coast occasionally offers a shelf of grassy terrace, 50 or 100 or 200 feet above the beach, and on those shelves there is a trail in the ordinary sense of the word. Cooskie Creek sits at the northern end of this arrangement, a few miles south of Punta Gorda. Spanish Flat sits further south, a broad, grassy bench where a lot of people camp because it is the first genuinely comfortable ground in a long while. The bluffs are the good news on this coastline. They are high ground. They are the answer to almost every question the ocean can ask. And they are the reason the tide zones have edges at all. Because a zone is defined by the absence of exactly this. Two things make them dangerous anyway. The first is that the bluffs are not permanent, and they do not fail politely. At Spanish Flat there used to be an old Jeep track running across the terrace, a relic of the era when somebody thought vehicles might belong here. It stops. Roughly 3 miles along, the track simply ends, taken out by erosion, and the accepted route is to drop back down to the beach and continue on cobble. That is a small detail that tells you something large. On ground made of sheared Franciscan rock, on a slope this steep, in a climate this wet, a bench that supported a vehicle within living memory can stop supporting a footpath. The second is more immediate. Around Kuski Creek, the way to avoid a pinch point in the shoreline is to leave the beach and climb the bluff on a route marked by cairns, following a user trail up the south side of an unnamed drainage. Cairns are piles of rocks stacked by whoever came last. They are not signage, they fall over. People build them in the wrong place with the best of intentions. And the consequence of taking the wrong line here was demonstrated with unusual clarity on the 25th of March in 2025, when two hikers on this coast left the established trail and followed what they took for the main path. It was a game trail. One of them fell and ended up stranded roughly 60 feet above the sea on steep, unstable ground, with a dislocated shoulder, unable to move up or down. The other could not reach a safe position either. 6 agencies responded. There were people on jet skis, water rescue teams in the surf, and a helicopter. And the operation required specialized equipment and a great deal of training to conclude with both hikers alive. The fire chief at Shelter Cove, Nick Pape, put the essential fact of the incident in one sentence. There was no established trail where the hikers were before one of them fell. Both survived. That is worth saying plainly because this list is not an argument that everyone who makes a mistake here dies. It is an argument about how expensive mistakes are and about who has to pay for them. A dislocated shoulder in a city is an emergency room visit. A dislocated shoulder 60 feet up a crumbling slope on this coast is 6 agencies and an aircraft. There's a third thing about the bluffs that only shows up if you spend a night on one, and the campsites at Spanish Flat are where most people meet it. Grassy terraces on an exposed coast are magnificent, and they are also the windiest ground available. The King Range funnels air down its western face, idouts calmawos and chpolz, the afternoon northwesterly builds through the day, and a tent pitched on a bench 200 feet above the surf can spend the night being tested in a way that a tent behind a driftwood pile at a creek mouth is not. Gear fails up there. People lose a night's sleep up there. And a group that starts a tide-controlled crossing on no sleep is a group whose 1 mile per hour estimate has quietly become a fiction. That is the pattern worth taking away from the bluff sections generally. They do not hurt you directly. They degrade the inputs to the decision you will make several hours later, somewhere with less margin. So the bluffs sit at 11, above the tide zone at Punta Gorda, for a reason that inverts what you would expect. The beach hazards give you a clear rule and a printed table. The bluff hazards give you a suggestion made of stacked rocks. The place where you have the most options is also the place where the route is least defined. And a route that is not defined is a route where individual judgment does all the work. 10. Big Flat. Roughly halfway down the northern section of the trail, the coastline relaxes. The mountain steps back, and there is a genuine terrace behind the beach with a creek running through it, driftwood shelters people have built and rebuilt for decades, and enough level ground that you could put a small town on it. It is the largest and most welcoming piece of real estate on the entire 24 miles. There is an airstrip, a dirt strip on the flat with, for a long time, a pirate flag serving as a windsock. There are private inholdings, land that stayed in private hands when the federal conservation area was drawn around it. And there is a surf break offshore that has a reputation among a small, committed group of people who consider a full day of walking, or a small plane, to be an acceptable price for uncrowded waves on a coast with no crowds at all. By every visual cue, Big Flat is the safe place. It is flat, it is high enough, it has water, it has shelter, it has a landing strip, which is a piece of infrastructure that implies somebody could come and get you. Here is why it is at 10, and this is the entry where the criterion starts doing real work. Big Flat sits at the far end of everything. It is about as far from a road as it is possible to be on this coastline. The nearest inland exit is the Buck Creek Trail a little to the south, which climbs from the beach up toward the crest of the King Range, and climbing it means gaining thousands of feet on a steep, overgrown route while carrying whatever you brought. That's a serious undertaking for a healthy person with a full day of light. For an injured person, or a party carrying an injured person, it is not an option at all. It is a line on a map that looks like an exit and functions as a wall. The airstrip is the part that deserves the most caution, because it is the most misleading object on the coast. It's a strip of dirt on a flood-prone flat in a place with no weather reporting, no lighting, no fuel, no services, no approach aids, and a mountain range immediately behind it. Aircraft do use it. Whether an aircraft can use it on the specific afternoon when you need one, in the specific weather that is probably part of why you need one, is an entirely different question, and the honest answer is often no. A runway that only works in good conditions is not a rescue asset in the conditions that produce rescues. And Big Flat is bracketed. It sits between the two long impassable zones. To leave it northward, you eventually re-enter the 4-mile corridor between Sea Lion Gulch and Randall Creek. To leave it southward, you enter the 4.5-mile corridor from Miller Flat down to Gitchell Creek. The flat itself is safe. The flat is also a room with 2 doors, and both doors are on timers. That's the specific thing Big Flat does to people, and it is different from every hazard below it on this list. It does not remove your options in an instant. It shows you a place that removes them slowly, comfortably, while you are relaxed. Somebody who twists an ankle badly at Big Flat has not had an accident that is dangerous in itself. They have had an accident that converts a 2-day walk into a problem that, without a satellite device, may take a day or more to even communicate. The surf break deserves a paragraph of its own, because it produces the most concentrated version of the problem on the whole coast. A reef break in front of Big Flat, in a place with no crowd, no jet ski patrol, no lifeguard, no beach in the ordinary sense, and no road, is an extremely attractive proposition to a particular kind of surfer, and the people who go there are generally very good. They are also, while they are in the water, further from medical help than almost anyone else in California. The nearest hospital is a drive from a trailhead that is itself a day's walk away. Whatever goes wrong out there, from a board injury to a dislocated shoulder to a bad hold down, has to be dealt with on a beach by whoever is standing on it for a long time. Competence changes the odds of an incident. It does not change the response time by a single minute. That distinction runs through this entire list, and it is nowhere sharper than at Big Flat, where the most skilled visitors on the coast put themselves in the position with the fewest options. A note on that word, comfortable, because it recurs on this coast in a way that stopped being a coincidence somewhere around the 3rd entry. Bear Harbor is comfortable. Spanish Flat is comfortable. Big Flat is the most comfortable ground on the entire route. Every one of them is a place where the land offers a genuine reprieve, and the surrounding geography does not. And the reprieve is what makes people stop counting hours. 9 is the stretch from Miller Flat down to Gitchell Creek, which is the longest impassable zone on the coast. 4.5 miles. Tide under 3 feet. At the published pace, that is 4.5 hours of walking. And the walking is on the worst possible surface for maintaining a pace, which is a mixed cobble and boulder beach with occasional slide debris and sections of soft sand that eat energy at a rate people always underestimate. Between the two ends, there are 2 creeks that matter, and they are the whole reason this zone is at 9 instead of higher. Buck Creek comes down first, out of a steep-walled canyon, and there is camping there. Shipman Creek comes next, and there is camping there too. Both are places where you can climb up out of reach of the water, stop, and let the tide do whatever it is going to do for the next 6 hours. In a corridor whose defining characteristic is that it has no exits, 2 of them is a meaningful number. They are also both an illustration of how this coast turns one hazard into another. The federal guidance on creek crossings here is specific, and it is the kind of specific that comes from experience. There are no bridges. When you cross, watch the ocean and cross as far from the waves as you can get. Do not cross if the water is above your knee. Wait for it to come down. Buck Creek is the one that tests that rule. Draining a steep, narrow canyon, it can turn into a genuine torrent in spring and early summer when the snowmelt and the stored rainfall come down together. And a creek that is a pleasant, ankle-deep step in September is a different object in April. So the escape hatch has a season. In the months when the weather is most likely to trap you in the zone, the creek that would let you climb out of it is at its most difficult to reach because the crossing is at its worst. Both hazards peak on the same calendar, and there is a second failure that is easy to miss. A creek in flood on this coast does not just block you, it rearranges the beach at its mouth, dumping gravel and logs into the intertidal zone, which changes where the water runs and where the footing is. The map in your head from the last time or from somebody's trip report ages badly. At the southern end, Gitchell Creek is the gate. Get past it, and you are on the last approach to Black Sands Beach, and the corridor lets go. Get to it too late, and you have 4.5 miles of rising water behind you. Why does this sit at 9 rather than higher when it is the longest zone with the most walking hours in it? Because of the arithmetic of exits. 2 escape creeks in the middle of 4.5 miles means that on average, at any given moment inside it, you are within about a mile of a place where you can climb up and wait. A mile is an hour. An hour is usually enough. There is also a psychological feature of this particular zone that the northern one does not share, and it works in your favor. Miller Flat to Gitchell Creek is the last leg. People walking it are usually on their final day. They know Shelter Cove is at the end of it, and a target that concrete does wonders for pace discipline. Groups that dawdled for 3 days will move through this section like they mean it. That is a real effect, and it is worth counting. Number 8 is the 4 miles between Sea Lion Gulch and Randall Creek, and there, none of that applies. Start with the numbers, side by side with the one above it, because that comparison is the entire justification for the position. Miller Flat to Gitchell Creek, 4.5 miles, 3 feet, 2 solid mid-zone escapes. Sea Lion Gulch to Randall Creek, 4 miles, 2.5 feet, and a middle that is much less generous. The half-mile shorter does not help you. The half-foot of tide allowance costs you, and it costs more than it sounds. Half a foot of vertical water on a steep beach translates into a surprising amount of horizontal beach, and more importantly, it translates into time, because the tide is a curve. Raising the bar from 2.5 feet to 3 feet does not shave a few minutes off your window. It can remove an hour from both ends of it. On a lot of days, the difference between a 3-foot rule and a 2.5-foot rule is the difference between a window and no window at all. There is a genuine wrinkle here worth flagging, because it affects a decision people actually have to make. The federal agency's public tide safety guidance for this coast gives a single blanket rule. Do not hike in the impassable zones when the tide is above 3 feet. The permit information for the individual zones is more granular and gives different numbers for each, with this one at 2.5. Those 2 documents are not in conflict about the direction of caution, but they will give you different answers on some days. The conservative reading, and the one that costs you nothing but time, is to use the stricter of the 2 numbers for whatever section you are entering, and to require that the tide will stay below it for the entire estimated crossing, plus a real margin, in daylight, having entered on a falling tide. If that condition is not met, the correct action is not to go faster. It is not to go at all. and instead to camp at the creek camps on whichever side of the zone you are on and take the next window, which is why the guidance for this coast includes carrying more food than the itinerary requires. Being a day late off this trail is an inconvenience. Being inside a zone on a rising tide is not. Inside the corridor itself, the geometry is exactly what was described at the start. Rock on the left, ocean on the right, cobble underfoot, and no bluff to climb. There is one meaningful break in the middle, at Kuski Creek, and the bluff route above it, and after that the beach carries you the rest of the way. Trip accounts from this section describe a specific and unpleasant double exposure. Rocks working loose from the slope above while the waves are arriving at your feet. That is not atmosphere. On a slope of sheared rock that is being uplifted and rained on and undercut by surf, material comes down, and it comes down onto the only strip of ground you are allowed to walk on. The other feature of this zone is where it is. It is in the northern half of the coast, which means it is about as far as you can get from Shelter Cove, where the only local emergency service with an ocean rescue capability is based. Everything that arrives here arrives from a distance. The Coast Guard flies out of Air Station Humboldt Bay, which operates a small number of MH-65 helicopters covering roughly 250 miles of coastline from the Mendocino and Sonoma County line north to the Oregon border. That's a serious capability, and it has pulled a lot of people off this shore. It is also, by definition, not standing by at Randall Creek. A Coast Guard account of one incident on this stretch describes what a bad day here looks like when everything compounds. 4 hikers on a remote section of the trail near the Randall Creek area. One man falls from a cliff, takes a head injury, and is pulled out into the water. The other 3 go into the surf to reach him. They get him back, and they sustain injuries of their own doing it. And in the process, they lose all of their gear to the ocean. All 4 make it back to shore, hurt and cold, in a place with no signal. What saves them is that they are able to recover one of the bags, and in that bag is a satellite messenger. And with it, they reach the outside world and a helicopter comes. The sequence matters more than the outcome. A single fall converted inside of a few minutes into 4 injured people with no equipment, no shelter, no dry clothing, no food, and no way to communicate, in a corridor with no exit and no one coming, because no one knew. Every one of the 4 options in the criterion was gone at once. They got one of them back by accident because a bag washed in. 2 things in that account are worth separating out because they cut in opposite directions, and the honest version needs both. The first is that the 3 who went into the water were doing the thing that human beings reliably do. And the record on this coast says it is the single most dangerous decision available to a bystander here. It also worked. They got him back. That's not an argument that it was a good idea. It is an argument that the outcomes of that decision are widely spread, and the spread includes cases further down this list where the would-be rescuer is the one who died. The second is the bag. Everything that happened after they reached shore turned on a piece of luck. 1 pack out of 4, coming back in on the same water that took them with the satellite messenger still in it. Strip that detail out of the story, and you have 4 injured, soaked people on a cobble beach inside an impassable zone with a rising tide, no gear, and nobody in the world aware of it. There's no version of that where a search starts within a day, because the trigger for a search would have been somebody failing to arrive somewhere, and the people expecting them were expecting them in 2 or 3 days. That gap between when a party gets into trouble and when the outside world first suspects it is the least discussed number on this entire coastline, and probably the most important one. That is why this stretch sits at 8, and why the 6 places above it have to clear a very high bar. It is also the point where one of the candidate answers to the open question can be retired. If tide range were the variable that decides how deadly a place is, then the ranking of the 3 impassable zones would follow their thresholds exactly, and the tightest one would be the most dangerous place on this coast. It is not. It is number 8. There are 7 places above it where the tide is not the mechanism at all. The next 5 places on this list are different in kind from everything below them, and the difference should be stated before the count continues. Everything from 20 down to 8 has been about people who came here on purpose in the last 60 years or so for recreation. The next 5 have been killing people since long before anyone thought of this coastline as a destination. They are not hiking hazards. Most of them cannot be walked to at all. They belong on a list of the deadliest places on the Lost Coast because the criterion does not care what kind of vehicle you arrived in. The question is how fast the place takes your options away, and for the better part of 2 centuries, this stretch of water took them away from professional mariners faster than almost anywhere else on the American Pacific. 7. False Cape. A few miles north of Cape Mendocino, near where the Bear River comes down to the sea in Humboldt County, there is a headland. It is a substantial piece of land. It pushes west, and from certain angles, at certain distances, in the sort of visibility this coast specializes in, it looks like the Cape. That is the entire hazard, and the name is the evidence. There was a post office here called False Cape from 1870 until 1879, when it was renamed Cape Town, and the settlement site sits about 3 miles northeast of Cape Mendocino on the Bear River. Nobody names a place False Cape as a joke. The name records a recurring mistake serious enough that the local community adopted the mistake as its address. Understand what that mistake cost in the age of sail and early steam? Cape Mendocino is the primary navigational reference for this section of coast. If you are running south with the land to port and you identify the Cape correctly, you know exactly where you are. You know where the offshore dangers lie, and you know when to alter course. If you identify the wrong headland as the Cape, every subsequent decision is made from a false position, and you make the turn that would have cleared the danger several miles too early, which puts you inside it. That's the purest possible example of the criterion. False Cape does not remove your options with water or rock. It removes them by corrupting the one input that everything else depends on, knowing where you are. A navigator who has misidentified a headland has lost the ability to retreat correctly, because the retreat is also computed from the wrong position. Every option is still there, and every one of them now points the wrong way. The modern echo is not exact, but it is close enough to be worth noticing. This coastline is unusually difficult to read from within it. The headlands repeat. The creeks look alike. The bluffs rise and drop in a rhythm that flattens out in fog, and there are long stretches where the only reliable landmarks are the named creeks, which are not labeled on the ground. People walking this coast misidentify where they are with some regularity, and the consequence is almost always the same. They believe they are closer to the end of an impassable zone than they actually are, and they make a decision about the tide based on a position that is off by a mile or two. False Cape sits at 7, above the impassable zones, because an error of position is upstream of every other error. Everything below this point on the list can be managed by a person who knows where they are and what time it is. Nothing below this point can be managed by a person who is confidently wrong about either. 6. Steamboat Rock. South of the Cape, standing off the shore in the water, is a substantial rock formation with a long, low profile and a raised section at one end. Local usage calls it Battleship Rock because of that shape. On the charts, it is Steamboat Rock, and it lies about 2 miles south of Sugarloaf Island, at the southern edge of the South Cape Mendocino State Marine Reserve. The California Department of Fish and Wildlife maintains a special closure around it, which in practice means that the taking of marine life is prohibited across the reserve, and that the rock and the water immediately around it are set aside because of what lives there. Seabirds nest on these formations, sea lions haul out on them. The closures exist so that those colonies are not disturbed. A rock is not, on its own, a deadly place. What makes this one worth a position is the specific way a formation like this behaves in a seaway. And it is a thing that people who have only seen the ocean from a beach almost never account for. Water does not flow smoothly around a large obstruction in a swell. It piles up on the seaward face, wraps around both sides, and the two wrapped flows meet again on the backside and interfere with each other. The result is confused water, standing chop, and unpredictable surges in the lee, which is precisely the place a small boat would go looking for shelter. The apparent refuge behind a rock in a big swell is one of the more reliable traps in coastal boating. It looks calmer because the wave faces are broken up. What it actually is disorganized, which is worse because a boat can be handled in regular swell and cannot be handled in water arriving from 3 directions at once. Add to that the shape of the thing. Any formation big enough to be mistaken for a vessel is big enough to be mistaken for something farther away than it is, and the raised end changes the apparent aspect depending on your angle, which is exactly the same failure mode as false cape at a smaller scale. There's a second, quieter thing about Steamboat Rock and the closures around it, and it belongs on a list about options. The reason the state protects these rocks is that they are among the few places on this coastline where seabirds can nest and pinnipeds can breed without being reached. No predator that walks gets out there. No person gets out there casually. The colonies exist precisely because the water around the rock removes everybody's options equally, including the foxes. That is a strange thing to admire, and it is worth admiring anyway. The same property that makes a place lethal to a small boat is what makes it viable for a cormorant. Inaccessibility is not a moral quality, and it does not care who benefits from it. On this coast, it protects seabird colonies, it protects sea lion pups, and, as this list has been arguing from the bottom, it protects a great many people who never learn that it did. It ranks above False Cape for a narrow reason. False Cape gives you a wrong position, which is recoverable the moment you get a second fix on anything. Steamboat Rock takes something more basic, which is the idea that there is shelter available. Out here, in these conditions, there is no shelter. The nearest thing to a harbor of refuge on this entire 100-mile coastline is a small cove at Shelter Cove that is open to the swell from most directions and is a harbor mainly by virtue of being the only candidate. 5. Sugarloaf Island. Standing just off the headland of Cape Mendocino is a sea stack 326 feet high. It's the westernmost island in California. It is a cone of rock rising straight out of deep water, and it is one of the more genuinely striking objects on the American coast. It is also a stellar sea lion breeding site, a California sea lion haul-out, and a nesting rock for western gulls, 3 species of cormorant, black oyster catchers, pigeon guillemots, and tufted puffins. That combination, breeding pinnipeds and nesting seabirds on the same rock, is why the state maintains a special closure here and why nothing may be taken from the water around it. Now the part that matters for this list. A 326-foot rock sitting immediately off a headland does 2 things to the water. It concentrates it, because the flow that would otherwise pass across that area is squeezed into the gap between the stack and the shore. And squeezed water moves faster, and it reflects it. A vertical rock face does not absorb a wave. It sends it back out to sea, where it meets the next wave arriving, and the two of them add together into a peak that can be considerably steeper and higher than either one on its own, in a spot that is nowhere near the beach and has no pattern a person could learn. Sailors have a word for the resulting sea state, and it is not complimentary. It is the kind of water where a vessel is not fighting waves so much as being handed a new problem every 8 seconds from a direction it did not expect. The rock has one more feature that decides its position. It is beautiful, and it is close to shore, and it sits directly off a stretch of coastline that a paved public road reaches. That is unusual for this list. Almost everything ranked below Sugarloaf Island is somewhere you have to work to get to. This is somewhere you can drive to and look at, and the water between the road and the rock is some of the most disorganized on the coast, which is worth stopping on for a second because a candidate answer to the open question just died. If distance from the nearest road decided how deadly a place is, Sugarloaf Island would rank at the bottom of this list with the parking lots, and Big Flat would be at the top. The opposite has happened. The road here is not a mitigation, it's a delivery system. It brings people who have made no preparation at all to the edge of water that has been killing prepared professionals for 150 years. And it sets them down on the beach with a camera. That observation is going to matter twice more before this is finished. 4. Blunt's Reef. About 3 miles off Cape Mendocino, there is a patch of rock that does not break the surface consistently and does not appear as anything at all when the sea is up. It's the reason a great many ships are on the bottom off this cape. And it is the reason the United States government kept a crewed vessel permanently anchored in one of the roughest pieces of water on the West Coast for 66 years. That is the fact worth pausing on. Not the reef, the response to it. A lightship is a floating lighthouse. It is a vessel with a light and a fog signal, moored on station in a place where a tower cannot be built, and it stays there. In heavy weather, it does not run for shelter, because the entire point of it is to be exactly where it is when the weather is at its worst, and the reef is at its most invisible. The Blunt's Reef Station was established in 1905 and operated until 1971, with a succession of vessels taking the duty. In 1971, the Coast Guard finally withdrew the ship and replaced it with a large navigational buoy, which is what marks the reef today. 66 years of cruise, sitting on a mooring in that water, in fog, in the winter swell, riding out storms in a hull designed to stay put rather than to go anywhere, so that other people could work out where the rocks were. If you want a demonstration of what the criterion means at its most extreme, that is it. Those men had made a professional decision to give up, permanently, the option to retreat. They could not move off station. That was the job. And it paid off in a way that is documented and worth telling. In 1916, the passenger steamer Bear went aground near the Cape. Accounts of the wreck record 5 deaths in the surf. And then something remarkable. About 150 survivors were taken aboard the lightship and packed onto a vessel that was never designed to hold anything like that number, and held there until they could be moved ashore safely. The only refuge available in that stretch of ocean was a ship that had been deliberately anchored in the worst part of it. Then there is the 20th of December, 1941. 13 days after Pearl Harbor, the tanker Emilio was attacked off Cape Mendocino by the Japanese submarine I-17. The crew got away in lifeboats, and where they rowed to, on a coastline that offers essentially nowhere to land, was the Blunt's Reef lightship. Twice, in 2 different centuries of maritime trouble, the answer to the question of where to go on this coast was a boat that could not leave. That's the entire argument for Blunt's Reef at number 4. It's a hazard you cannot see 3 miles from shore, in a place with no harbor, and the historical solution to it was to station human beings in permanent proximity to it, because there was no other way. The reef takes the most fundamental option of all, which is the option to know that there is a problem, and it takes it before anything else happens. 3. Cape Mendocino. At 124 degrees, 24 minutes, and 34 seconds west, Cape Mendocino is the westernmost point on the coast of California. 16th century Spanish navigators named it for Antonio de Mendoza, the Viceroy of New Spain, and for the better part of 250 years, the Manila galleons used it as their landfall on the return crossing, running east across the Pacific until they found this piece of land and then turning south for Acapulco. Think about what that means as a piece of navigation. Ships crossing thousands of miles of open ocean with no reliable way of fixing longitude aimed at a coast, and used the westernmost lump of it as the marker that told them the crossing was over. Cape Mendocino has been the most important single reference point on this entire coastline since before there was a United States. It is also, by a considerable margin, the most dangerous. The Cape does several things at once. It pushes furthest west, which means it takes the swell first and takes it most directly. It sits at the boundary, where the coastal weather pattern changes character, and the fog here is legendary among people who have worked this water. It has Sugarloaf standing off it, and Blunt's Reef 3 miles out and rocks in the shallows in between. And it has no harbor, no anchorage worth the name, and no lee. There is no side of Cape Mendocino you can get behind. In 1868, the government put a light on it, and the details of that project say everything about the place. The tower was iron, 43 feet tall, 16-sided, with double balconies. What made it remarkable was where it went, 422 feet above the sea, which made it one of the highest lighthouses in the United States. It was first lit on the 1st of December, 1868, showing one white flash every 30 seconds. Building it nearly did not happen. In September of 1867, the lighthouse tender Shubrick was steaming toward the Cape loaded with men and materials for the station when it struck a rock about 30 miles south in dense fog and holed itself. The captain ran the vessel aground deliberately rather than let it sink. The materials for a lighthouse meant to prevent wrecks were lost in a wreck. In the fog, the lighthouse was being built to address before the lighthouse existed. A workman drowned while bricks were being landed at the site. In 1881, 3 men, including the district inspector Charles McDougall, died when their rowboat capsized during a supply delivery. Everything about servicing that station had to come by sea onto a shore with no landing, and the record of the cost is in the personnel files. And there is a design irony in the elevation that anyone who has spent time around lighthouses will recognize. Putting a light 422 feet up gives it enormous theoretical range, and it has a well-known drawback. When the fog layer forms below the lantern, the beam shines out over the top of it, clean and bright, and completely invisible to the ships underneath, which are precisely the ships in trouble. High lights look magnificent on a clear night. The nights that matter are not clear. The tower is not there anymore. In November of 1998, it was taken down and moved about 35 miles south to Shelter Cove, where it was reassembled at Point Delgada in Malcolm's Park and dedicated in September of 2000. It is now a public monument in a small coastal town, which is a strange and honest ending for it. The light that could not save the ships beneath the fog is a thing tourists photograph from a lawn. Then there is the ground, which is the reason Cape Mendocino ranks third and not somewhere lower on this list. The Mendocino Triple Junction is offshore of this cape, and this is one of the most seismically active places in the lower 48 states. That is not a background fact. It is an active mechanism that changes the coastline within human lifetimes. On the 25th of April, 1992, at 6 minutes past 11 in the morning, a magnitude 7.2 earthquake struck about 3 miles east of Petrolia at a depth of roughly 8 miles. It was the most damaging earthquake to hit California's north coast in the historical record. Damage ran to at least $60 million. More than 400 people were injured. In Petrolia, the shaking started fires, and historic buildings burned, including a general store that had stood for about a century. 2 large aftershocks, magnitude 6.5 and 6.6, followed within 18 hours. A modest tsunami was recorded on 7 tide gauges from California to southern Oregon and in Hawaii. One piece of it belongs on this particular list. Along roughly 15 miles of coastline just west of Petrolia, the earthquake lifted the ground. In places, the uplift reached about 5 feet, and it created a new coastal terrace in an afternoon. Intertidal rock that had been underwater at every tide was suddenly permanently dry, and the organisms living on it died where they sat, which is how the uplift was measured so precisely, 5 feet. On a coast where the difference between a passable beach and a lethal corridor is a tide line drawn at 3 feet. This is the point where the tide tables and the geology stop being separate subjects. Every number in every planning document for this coastline is measured against a datum, and the datum assumes the land holds still. Here, on a scale of decades to centuries, it does not. The shoreline people plan against is a snapshot of an arrangement that has been rearranged before, in living memory, in a single morning. The machine is still running. On the 20th of December, 2022, at 34 minutes past 2 in the morning, a magnitude 6.4 earthquake struck offshore near Ferndale at the northern edge of this same country. 2 people died. Around a dozen were injured. Roads buckled, homes and businesses were damaged, and more than 70,000 customers lost power. There were more than 270 aftershocks above magnitude 1, the largest of them magnitude 5.4. So Cape Mendocino takes the number 3 position on the strength of a compound case. It has taken lives at sea for as long as there are records. It defeated the 2 obvious engineering answers, a lighthouse that shone over the fog, and a lightship that had to be crewed and eventually withdrawn. It offers no shelter in any direction. And it sits directly on top of the mechanism that built this coastline and is still adjusting it on a time scale short enough that the safety numbers everyone relies on are, in the long run, provisional. And there is a detail about the Cape today that ought to be sitting uncomfortably by now. You can drive there. Madeley Road, the paved county route from Ferndale to Petrolia, comes down out of the hills and runs along the shore for a few miles right at Cape Mendocino. It is the only stretch on the entire Lost Coast where a public paved road and the open Pacific occupy the same ground. People pull over. They walk down to the beach. They stand on the sand at the westernmost point of California, a few hundred yards from water that has been sinking ships since the 16th century, with a car parked behind them and their phone out. Nothing about that arrangement is announced. There's no gate, no ranger, no ticket, no boat, no permit, and no 4-hour crossing. The filter that keeps almost everyone away from Blunt's Reef and Sugarloaf and Steamboat Rock is simply not present here, because a road happens to arrive. 2 places on this coast are more dangerous than Cape Mendocino. Neither of them is remote, neither of them is offshore, and both of them are places you can park a car. 2. Point Delgada and the shoreline of Shelter Cove. Roughly halfway down the Lost Coast, the King Range throws out one last headland before the country changes, and on that headland sits the only settlement of any size, on 100 miles of coastline. Shelter Cove occupies Point Delgada. It has something in the neighborhood of 800 residents. It is about 54 miles south of Eureka, and about 43 miles north-northwest of Fort Bragg. And getting to it means driving over the ridge from Redway, on a road that takes about 45 minutes to cover 22 miles. By the standards of everything discussed so far, Shelter Cove is a metropolis. There's a general store. There are places to stay. There's a golf course, in the middle of which sits Shelter Cove Airport, a single-runway general aviation field on about 50 acres, which puts a landing strip and a 9-hole golf course in the same footprint in a way that visitors find funny and pilots find perfectly normal. There is a fire department. There's a boat launch. There is, in Malcolm's Park, the Iron Tower from Cape Mendocino, reassembled and painted and standing on a mown lawn a very long way from the fog that defeated it. There is also cellular coverage, which after everything above deserves to be said slowly. In Shelter Cove most of the time, you can call for help with the thing in your pocket. So why does the most developed, best served, most connected point on this entire coastline sit at number 2 on a list of its deadliest places? Because none of that infrastructure touches the mechanism, and all of it increases the number of people standing in front of it. Start with the shoreline itself. Point Delgada is a rocky headland. The water around it is full of the same reefs and stacks and tide pool platforms that make the rest of this coast what it is. And those platforms are exactly the sort of place people walk out onto. They are flat. They are covered in interesting life. At low tide, they look like a floor. They are, in reality, a shelf that spends part of every day underwater, coated in algae with roughly the coefficient of friction of wet glass, sloping toward deep water, and positioned so that the swell arriving from the northwest wraps around the point and comes at them from an angle that is hard to anticipate from land. People fish from those rocks. People take photographs from those rocks. People walk children out onto those rocks. And the run-up behavior described earlier does not know or care that there is a town behind it. Then the cove. Shelter Cove is named for what it is relative to the rest of this coast, which is the only place a vessel can get any protection at all, and that is a low bar. It is not an enclosed harbor. There is no breakwater arm wrapping around a basin full of flat water. It is an indentation in the coast that offers a lee from some directions and nothing from others, and boats are launched off the beach into open swell rather than ease down a ramp into a marina. On a good day, it is a genuinely pleasant place to put a boat in the water. On the wrong day, with the wrong swell direction, the same operation is a serious piece of seamanship performed by people who are, quite often, on vacation. And then there is the one asset Shelter Cove has that no other point on this coast has, which is a locally based ocean rescue capability. The Shelter Cove Fire Department runs one. That's a genuine, meaningful asset, and it has saved lives. It also exists for a reason, and the reason is the argument of this entire entry. The Ocean Rescue Team at Shelter Cove was formed in the year 2000. It was formed because in March of that year, 3 people were washed off the beach a short distance north of town and drowned. That is what it took. A small volunteer fire department in a town of a few hundred people concluded that it needed a water rescue capability because the water on its doorstep had killed 3 people at once. The shape of that is worth holding still for a moment. The infrastructure here is not evidence that the place is safe. It is a scar. Every piece of emergency capability on this headland exists because something happened that made it necessary. And the something happened within sight of the houses. The same logic applies to the airport. A single runway on a headland in a town of 800 people is not there because the golf course needed a centerpiece. It is there because a place this far from a hospital, on roads this unreliable, needs a way for people to arrive and leave that does not depend on the road being open. That is an entire community's answer to the 4th question in the criterion, built out of asphalt, and it works in good weather. And that qualification, in good weather, follows this place around. The road over the ridge from Redway is open until a slide takes it. The airport works until the ceiling comes down. The Ocean Rescue Team can launch until the swell is too big to launch into. Every capability at Shelter Cove is real, and every one of them degrades on exactly the same weather system that produces the emergencies it exists to answer. Here is the specific failure that puts Point Delgada at number 2. And it is a failure that the 12 entries below it are largely immune to. Everywhere else on this coast, the environment tells you the truth. The road to Usal announces what it is in the first mile. The impassable zones are signed, mapped, and published with numbers. Big Flat is 2 days from a road, and nobody who walks there is unclear about that. The information is available, and more importantly, the surroundings are consistent with the information. Difficult country looks difficult. Shelter Cove looks like a town. It has a store and a golf course and a paved road and a fire department and phone signal. And every one of those things is a signal to the human nervous system that this is a managed environment where the consequences of ordinary carelessness have been engineered down to survivable levels. That signal is correct about almost everything within the town limits. It is completely wrong about the water, and the water is 20 yards from the parking spaces. There is one more element, and it is the reason this entry is at 2 rather than at 4 or 5. Shelter Cove is a destination. People come here specifically to be at the ocean, which is not true of anywhere else on this list except the beaches. Weekend traffic, holiday traffic, summer traffic. The population standing on the rocks on a fine Saturday in July is many times the population of the town. The 4 options at Point Delgada do something none of the other entries produce. Retreat is available right up until it is not, and the transition takes about 2 seconds. Calling is available and mostly useless because on the timescale of a person being pulled off a rock platform, a phone call is not a rescue mechanism. The fire department is minutes away, and minutes is a very long time. Waiting is not available at all, and being reached, here of all places, is genuinely fast by the standards of this coastline. And the record shows that fast is frequently not fast enough, which sets up the last entry because there is exactly one place on the Lost Coast where all of that is true and the numbers are worse. 1. Black Sands Beach. At the north end of Shelter Cove, Beach Road ends at a parking area on a bluff. There is a sign, there's a view, there is a short path down, and at the bottom of it, there is a beach of dark gray and black gravel, running north for about 3 miles, until it reaches Gitchell Creek and the country closes up again. That is the whole approach: paved road, parking lot, a few minutes from a store where you can buy a sandwich. It's the single easiest piece of the Lost Coast to reach. It is the southern trailhead of the Lost Coast Trail, and it is the most photographed shoreline on the entire 100 miles. It is also, by the criterion this list has been applying from the beginning, the deadliest place on this coast. And it is not close. Start with the sand, because the sand is the mechanism. The beach is dark because the King Range is dark. The rock behind it is that sheared, broken Franciscan material described at the start, and the range sheds it continuously into the sea, where the surf grinds it into gravel and coarse sand and pushes it back up onto the shore. What you are standing on is the mountain in transit. Coarse sediment builds a specific kind of beach. Fine sand spreads into a long, shallow ramp. That is the beach at a family resort, where the water comes up over a wide flat and arrives at your ankles with most of its energy already spent. Coarse gravel does the opposite. It stacks. It builds a steep face, and steep beach faces are the single most important variable in the fatality record on the Northern California coast. The National Weather Service has been explicit about this for years, and the language is worth taking literally. A steep beach slope lets the full force of the ocean waves reach up onto the sand and strike with real speed and power. Once you are down, the retreating water pulls you down the slope, and on that gradient, in that gravel, there is nothing to get a foothold against. The same agency has counted the consequences. Among the beaches of Humboldt County, the ones with the worst fatality records are the steep ones, and the list it publishes has Black Sands Beach on it alongside the lagoon beaches to the north. Then add the run-up. Long period swell arriving from thousands of miles away occasionally stacks, so that one arrival goes very much farther up the beach than the 20 before it did. The National Weather Service puts the figure at up to 100 yards beyond where the preceding waves reached. 100 yards on a beach that is not 100 yards wide means the entire beach, including the dry part, including the driftwood line where people set their packs down, including the log somebody is sitting on to change their socks. There's no warning for a specific one. The setup can be forecast, and advisories are issued when the swell conditions make them likely, most often in the winter half of the year. The individual event cannot be forecast, and that is the whole problem Because the human safety system for beaches is built on the assumption that danger looks dangerous. Here, the danger looks exactly like the 20 minutes before it. Now the record? Because this is the entry where the incident reports do most of the work. In March of the year 2000, a woman of 47, a parent acting as a chaperone for a student group from Canada, was swept off this beach. Two 17-year-old students went in after her. All three drowned. That's the event that produced the ocean rescue team at Shelter Cove Fire, and it is worth stating plainly what that means. A volunteer fire department in a town of a few hundred people acquired a water rescue capability because of a single afternoon on this beach. In January of 2013, a woman was struck by an unusually large wave at Little Black Sands, at the southern end of the same stretch, was swept out, and drowned. Local reporting records another case in which a 13-year-old boy was swept off a rock here in March, and his father drowned attempting the rescue. And on Sunday, the 29th of May, 2022, at about 2:45 in the afternoon, the Shelter Cove Fire Department received a call that waves had swept two people into the ocean about a mile north of the Black Sands Beach trailhead. The official account of what followed is specific. Conditions were rough. With swells running 15 to 20 feet and whitecaps, responders found one person treading water and a second person face down somewhere between 50 and 100 yards offshore. The sequence had started when the first hiker was swept in. The second took off their backpack and went in to help and was carried further out. The survivor was brought in by boat and jet ski to the marina and then flown to a hospital by air ambulance. The second was declared dead at the scene by paramedics. Count the agencies on that response because they are the answer to the fourth question in the criterion. Shelter Cove Fire, CAL FIRE, City Ambulance, the Humboldt County Sheriff's Office, Reach Air Ambulance, Southern Humboldt Technical Rescue, United States Coast Guard Sector Humboldt Bay. 7 agencies, including an aircraft and a boat, and a jet ski, and a technical rescue team, converging on a stretch of shoreline 1 mile from a paved parking lot. It was not enough, and it was never going to be enough, because of the time scale involved. This is the part that separates the top of this list from everything below it. The people who died on this beach did not have hours. They did not have the 6-hour tide window that governs the impassable zones, or the 2-day walkout that governs Big Flat, or the winter road closure that governs USAL. They had seconds. Whatever margin existed was gone before anyone on shore had finished understanding what they were watching, and the entire emergency apparatus of a county, some of it stationed a mile away, arrived into a situation that had already resolved itself. And there is a pattern running through those incidents that is the hardest thing on this list to write down. In the year 2000, 2 of the 3 who died had gone in to help the first. In 2022, the person who died had taken off their pack and gone in to help. In the case of the boy on the rock, the father drowned in the rescue attempt. That's not carelessness, and it should not be described as though it were. It is the most human response available, performed by people who were not equipped for the specific physics of a steep gravel beach in a heavy northwest swell. It is also, on this beach, the single most reliable way that one emergency becomes 2. Shelter Cove Fire's chief, describing the attempted rescue in 2022 from the shore, used the word helpless, and that word is doing precise work. There were people watching who wanted very much to act, and for whom acting would have made things worse. There's a geographical detail buried in these reports that only becomes visible when you line them up, and it is the sharpest thing on this page. The 2022 incident happened about a mile north of the trailhead. The drownings in the year 2000 happened, according to local accounts, very near the same spot. That is not the middle of the wilderness. It is not the impassable zone, which begins several miles further on. It's the first mile. The first mile is a specific kind of place, and every popular trailhead in the country has one. It is the strip where a beach stops being the town's beach and starts being the wilderness, and where the population is at its most mixed. Through hikers with permits and tide tables walk it, and so does everybody else. People who parked, walked down, and decided to keep going for a bit because the weather was nice and the sand went on. There is no gate at the end of the town. The dark gravel simply continues. The houses fall out of sight behind the bluff, and at some point that nobody marks, the beach a person is standing on stops having a road behind it. Somebody a mile up that beach with no pack, no tide table, and no particular plan is not doing anything foolish by the standards of any other American beach. They are on a public shoreline within sight of where they left the car. The gravel under their feet, the slope of it, and the swell arriving on it are identical to the gravel and slope and swell 4 miles further north, where everyone present is carrying a permit and watching the water like a hawk. That is where the incidents cluster, not at the far end, at the near end, where the filter has not started yet. This is where severity and frequency, kept separate all the way down this list, finally have to be multiplied together. And it is where the ranking stops being intuitive. On pure severity, Black Sands Beach does not win. The water off Cape Mendocino is more violent. Blunt's Reef has taken more ships. The corridor between Sea Lion Gulch and Randall Creek can remove every option a person has for 4 hours at a stretch, which is something a beach cannot do. On frequency, it is not close. This is the beach at the end of the paved road. At the trailhead, everybody photographs, next to the town with the store and the golf course and the phone signal, on the coastline that has spent the last decade appearing on lists of places to see before you die. The number of people standing on Black Sands Beach on a July weekend exceeds the number of people in every impassable zone on the coast, combined, by a margin that is not even worth arguing about. Multiply a fast mechanism by a large population, and you get the fatality record that exists. There is one more detail in that record, and it is the one that closes the argument. When the 2022 drowning happened, local reporting noted that it was very close to the same spot where 3 people had been washed off and drowned 22 years earlier. The same beach. Effectively, the same piece of it. 22 years apart with a trained ocean rescue team, created because of the first event, in existence for the whole of the interval. The capability improved. The signage improved. The awareness improved. The mechanism did not change at all, and neither did the number of people willing to stand within reach of it. There is one more thing about this beach that has to be said carefully, because it is the difference between a warning that works and one that gets ignored. Black Sands Beach is not a place people should stay away from. It's a public beach at the end of a public road. It is the trailhead for one of the best long walks in the United States, and the overwhelming majority of the people who go there have a completely uneventful afternoon and drive home. The published guidance for this coast is not a request that you avoid the shoreline. It is a very short list of behaviors, and every item on it is about position rather than about courage or fitness. Do not swim here. Never turn your back on the water. Do not stand or linger on wet sand or wet rock, because wet is the record of where the ocean has already been and the forecast of where it will be again. Stay off cliffs, off outcroppings, and away from steeply sloped beaches. Check for high swell and weather warnings before you go, and if an advisory is running, understand exactly what it does and does not tell you. It says the conditions favor an unusually long run-up, and it cannot say when. That is the whole list. It costs nothing. It is also, in almost every documented case on this beach, the thing that was not being done at the moment it mattered, which is not a moral failing. It is what happens when a stretch of gravel with a parking lot behind it stops reading as a hazard and starts reading as a view, which finally answers the question that has been sitting under this whole count. There was a variable to find, something that decides more reliably than anything else whether a given spot on this coastline is genuinely deadly or merely impressive. 5 candidates were named at the start, and the ladder has been quietly testing each of them. Distance from the nearest road went first. If that were the variable, the 7 places at the bottom of this list, the closed roads and the washed-out connectors and the coves you need a specific vehicle to reach, would be at the top. They are at the bottom. And the place at number 1 has a parking lot. The absence of a cellular signal went next, and it went cleanly. Black Sands Beach has coverage. The call in 2022 went out within moments. 7 agencies responded. A helicopter and a boat and a jet ski arrived, and one of the 2 people in the water died anyway. Communication is not the binding constraint when the event resolves in under a minute. It matters enormously at Big Flat, and it does not matter at all at the top of this list. Tide range failed at number 8. The 3 impassable zones have 3 different thresholds, and if the thresholds decided the ranking, the strictest zone would be first. It is 8th, and 7 things outrank it. Terrain violence failed at number 3. There's no honest argument that the surf on a gravel beach at Shelter Cove is more powerful than the water breaking over Blunt's Reef in a December storm. It is not. Cape Mendocino is the most physically hostile place on this coast, by a wide margin, and it finished 3rd. And water temperature was never a candidate, though it gets named constantly because it is a constant. The ocean is roughly the same temperature at the top and the bottom of this list. A value that does not vary between 2 places cannot explain why one of them is more dangerous than the other. It explains why this coast as a whole is unforgiving, and it explains nothing about the order. What is left is the thing that has been sitting in plain sight since the bottom of the list. Access is the variable, not because access is dangerous in itself, but because of what access removes. Remoteness is a filter. That's the function it performs, and it performs it invisibly and extremely well. 24 miles of dirt road removes almost everyone who is not committed. A permit you have to book 90 days out removes everyone who did not plan. A required bear canister removes everyone who did not read the rules. A 4-hour crossing with a published tide threshold removes everyone unwilling to look up a tide table. 2 days of walking removes everyone who is not fit enough, and a river crossing at knee height removes everyone who is not paying attention. None of those things is a safety feature on paper. Every single one of them is a safety feature in practice, because each one quietly takes a portion of the unprepared population and stops it several miles short of the hazard. A paved road to a parking lot at the top of a beach has no filter whatsoever. It admits everyone. It admits the experienced and the oblivious, in whatever proportion the region's tourism happens to supply, and it puts them all in the same place, on the same gravel, in front of the fastest option-removing mechanism on the entire coastline. And access does something else, subtler and worse. It changes what a place appears to be. Human beings read infrastructure as a promise. A paved road, a marked lot, a sign, a restroom, a town with a store 2 minutes away, all of it says the same thing to the part of the brain that assesses risk without being asked. Somebody is managing this. That inference is correct almost everywhere in modern American life. It is correct in the parking lot itself. It stops being correct at the waterline, and there is no visible boundary marking where. Now go back through the 19 entries with that in hand, because the list reorganizes. Read from the bottom up, and what you are looking at is a list sorted by how much of the unprepared population each place manages to turn away before it can do any harm. Usel Road at 20 is a genuinely brutal hazard with an extraordinarily strong filter, and the filter is why it sits at the bottom despite being able to strand you for a week. Bear Harbor and Whale Gulch are hazards with a filter made of miles. Big Flat is a hazard with a filter made of 2 days of walking. The impassable zones are hazards with a filter made of arithmetic. And the arithmetic, tedious and unwelcome as it is is doing an enormous amount of quiet work. Every person who reads a tide table and decides to wait 6 hours is a person who has been filtered out of an incident report. The offshore places are hazards with the strongest filter of all, which is a boat and the skills to use one. And it shows. The maritime casualties off Cape Mendocino belong overwhelmingly to an era when people had no alternative but to go there. And then the filter falls away, all at once, in the last 2 entries. Point Delgada and Black Sands Beach have no filter. They have a road, which retrospectively explains the strangest ranking on this list, the one at number 12. Punta Gorda was placed above the Matole River mouth and below the bluffs, not because a quarter-mile tide zone is dangerous, but because it is the coast's most efficient teacher of the wrong lesson, delivered to the largest available audience of casual visitors. That is the same argument as the top of this list, running at lower intensity. The place where the coast teaches people that its warnings are exaggerated, and the place where the coast collects the consequences, are the same kind of place, for the same reason. Both of them are easy to get to. One honest qualification, because a clean answer that ignores its own exceptions is not worth much. Access does not explain the middle of this list. From roughly 13 through 8, everybody is on foot. Everybody has walked at least a few miles, and the population is more or less uniformly filtered. In that band, the ranking is driven almost entirely by mechanism, by the length of the corridor, the tide threshold, the number of escape creeks, and the distance from any responder. Access is not a universal solvent. What it does is decide the extremes, and it decides where the bodies actually accumulate, which is a different and more uncomfortable measurement than where the danger is greatest, which produces a conclusion that is worth stating without decoration, because it runs against the grain of how people usually talk about wild coastlines. The single most effective piece of safety infrastructure on the Lost Coast is the fact that there is no highway. In 1984, the State Highway Department formally abandoned the idea of pushing Highway 1 through this country and stated that the construction was not feasible. That decision is remembered, when it is remembered at all, as a loss. 100 miles of magnificent coast that ordinary people cannot easily see. A regional economy that never got its coastal road. A gap on the map. It is also the reason this coastline has a fatality record measured in individual, memorable incidents rather than in annual statistics. Every mile of road not built here is a filter that has been operating continuously for 40 years. And the 2 places on this list where the road does arrive are the 2 places at the top. There is a version of that conclusion that would be too neat, and it is worth refusing. None of this means that building the road would have been wrong, or that the communities out here who wanted better access were mistaken to want it. People live in Petrolia, and Honeydew, and Whitethorn, and Shelter Cove. When the Matole Road closed for most of a winter, that was not a charming detail about a wild coast. It was families cut off from a pharmacy. Access is not a luxury for the people who live at the end of it, and a list about how tourists die does not get to make their argument for them. What the ranking actually shows is narrower and harder to dismiss. Access and exposure are the same thing seen from 2 directions. Every road that makes a place livable also makes it reachable by people who have no idea what it does, and there is no way to build the first without getting the second. Shelter Cove needs its road. Shelter Cove's road is also why Shelter Cove needed an ocean rescue team. That trait is not unique to this coastline, and it is the part of this list that travels. Anytime a beautiful, genuinely dangerous piece of coast gets a parking lot, a viewpoint, and a mention on a list of places to see, its position on a ranking like this one moves upward, and it moves upward before anybody has time to build the response capability that the new visitor numbers require. The hazard was always there. What changed is the size of the crowd standing in front of it and the average amount they know. So what does any of that buy a person who is actually going? The useful thing about a criterion, as opposed to a mood, is that you can carry it around. 4 questions. Asked before you commit to standing anywhere on this coast. Can I get back? Can anyone find out? Does waiting help? How long would it take for someone to arrive? If the answers are bad in 3 of the 4, the place deserves a level of care that has nothing to do with how it looks. Underneath that, the published guidance is specific, and it is specific because it was written by people who have had to go and collect the results of ignoring it. It is worth repeating in full rather than condensed because a partial version of a safety rule is frequently worse than none. On tides, check the predictions for the Shelter Cove station before you book a permit, not after, because the tide decides which dates are possible and the permit does not. Enter any impassable zone on a falling tide. Use the stricter of the published thresholds for the section you are entering. Require that the water will stay below that number for the entire crossing at the agency's rate of 1 mile per hour, plus a real margin in daylight. The agency does not recommend hiking these sections at night. If those conditions are not all met, the answer is not to move faster. It is to stop, camp above the water at the creek camps on whichever side you are on, and take the next window, which is the reason the standing advice is to carry more food than your itinerary strictly requires. If you need a rest or a campsite while you are inside a zone, the route out is up along the creeks, away from the shore and above the high water. On creeks, there are no bridges anywhere on this trail. Do not cross if the water is above your knee. Wait for it to subside. When you do cross, watch the ocean and cross as far from the waves as the ground allows. Because a creek mouth is where the 2 hazards overlap. Storms can make these crossings impossible within hours, which is a scheduling problem before it is a swimming problem. On the ocean itself, the guidance for this stretch of the Pacific is not a set of preferences. Do not swim here. Never turn your back on the water. Do not stand or linger on wet sand or wet rock, because wet means the water has already been there and will be again. Stay away from cliffs and steeply sloped beaches and off rocks and outcroppings. Check the swell forecast and any weather warnings before you leave, and understand what those warnings can and cannot do. They can tell you that the conditions favor a large run-up, and they cannot tell you when. On communication, there is effectively no cellular coverage across most of this coastline. Nearly every successful rescue in the recent record turned on a satellite messenger. That's not a gadget recommendation for its own sake. It's the difference between an injury that becomes a helicopter and an injury that becomes a search. And on the ordinary things that are easy to skip, a hard-sided bear canister is required, not suggested, and it has to hold every scented item you carry. Fire restrictions here get severe in dry years, to the point of prohibiting camp stoves, and they are posted at the trailheads. Check the roads and trails report before you drive, because a road that was open last month may not be. And one piece of planning that is not on any official list, but shows up in every incident report by its absence. Tell somebody specific, before you leave, exactly where you are going and exactly when you will be back. And make it somebody who will actually do something about it if you are not. On a coast where the first link in the rescue chain is somebody noticing, that conversation is the only part of the system a visitor controls completely. It costs 1 text message, and it can remove a full day from the interval between an accident and a search. None of that is difficult. All of it is boring, and boring is the point. Every item on that list is a filter you are applying to yourself, in advance, on purpose, in place of the filter that a highway would have removed. It is also worth being clear about what this list is not saying, because rankings of dangerous places have a bad habit of turning into arguments for staying home. Thousands of people walk this coastline every year, and the overwhelming majority of them have the trip of their lives. The elephant seals really are there. The bluffs at Spanish Flat really do look like that. Standing at the westernmost point of California with the swell coming in is worth the drive. And the 24 miles between the Mattel and Shelter Cove is one of the genuinely great walks in North America, which is exactly why the permit system had to be invented. Almost none of the danger described here is random. Nearly all of it is scheduled, published, posted at trailheads, printed in tide tables, and available months in advance to anyone willing to spend an evening reading. The people in the incident reports are not, on the whole, reckless people. They are people who were slightly off on a number, or who trusted a route marked by stacked rocks, or who were standing on wet gravel with their back to the water for the 40 seconds that mattered. Here is where the coast stands now, stated flatly. The number of people arriving keeps going up. Overnight use of the King Range Wilderness grew by more than 150% in under a decade, which is why there is a permit system at all, capping entries at 60 a day in the summer and 30 a day the rest of the year. That system does a good job of protecting the ground and the solitude. It does nothing to the water. At the same time, the access itself is getting less reliable. Usel Road has been closed along nearly 28 miles of its length with no reopening date. The road down to Needle Rock has been closed by storm damage with nowhere for walk-in visitors to park. The trail between Bear Harbor and Wheeler has been closed since storm damage in 2023. Matley Road lost most of a winter to a 90-acre landslide. Every one of those closures came from the same source, weak rock, on a steep slope in a place that takes that much rain and is being pushed upward by the most active plate boundary in the lower 48. That process is not slowing down, and the roads will keep failing, and each failure will keep sending more of the coast's visitors to the one part of it that is always open, which is the part that has already been counted. In March of the year 2000, 3 people drowned off a beach at the end of a paved road in Shelter Cove. The town responded by building an ocean rescue team. In May of 2022, that team, trained, equipped, and stationed roughly a mile away, went to essentially the same piece of sand, worked alongside 6 other agencies, brought one person out alive, and could not bring out the other. 22 years of full emergency response capability, and a beach that has not changed at all. If you have stood on any of these places, the comments are the useful place to put it, and there is a specific thing worth asking about rather than a general one. Name the place you would have put at number 1, and say which of the 4 options you think it takes away first: the way back, the ability to tell anyone, the option to wait, or the chance of being reached in time. That is a genuinely arguable question, and different answers to it are how ranking criteria get better. If your answer is somewhere that did not make this list at all, that is more interesting still, and it is worth saying why. And if working through a coastline this way, by exits and minutes instead of adjectives, is the sort of thing you want to keep running into, the like button is a reasonable way to register that, and subscribing is how you make it likely. One last thing about this particular 100 miles. The Lost Coast did not earn its name by being hidden. It earned it because the road stopped, and because a state highway department eventually put in writing that the road was never coming. That decision reads like a loss on a map, and on a list built around how quickly a place takes your options away, it is the single most protective thing that has ever happened here. The stretch nobody can drive to is not where this coast collects its dead. The stretch with the parking lot is.